Hello and welcome back. Our next video is on the period following World War I, known as conveniently the 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. Immediately after World War I is the first of what will unfortunately not be the only Red Scare. Red meaning communist. It is a scare, it is fear, it is terror about the looming threat of communism, specifically the more recent takeover of Russia by the Bolsheviks, leading to the Russian Revolution, eventually forming the communist led Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or as it is more commonly referred to, the Soviet Union. Importantly, please remember that the principles of communism are about no private property and a classless society. This is viewed as an existential threat to the beliefs, the philosophy, and the ideals of America. It is also important to note that the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, want to take over and conquer the world, as you can see here in this Russian political cartoon, right? So the idea is spreading the ideals of communism, staging a revolution not just in Russia, but here in America as well. Tied to this and underpinning a lot of the fear is the burgeoning labor movement, unionization. People are joining unions, are going on strikes, and a lot of the people organizing the strikes and unions are communist, or at least are sympathetic to the ideas of communism. Over 3,000 strikes occurred in the year 1919, most of them involving a loss of labor. Again, the fear of communism spreading from Russia to America is underpinning a lot of this, we would call it paranoia. They did win important advances, however: an 8.5 hour working day, higher wages, more healthcare benefits. All of these are gained through strikes and activism, but it's leading to an overall rise in fear and tensions. Combined with the Red Scare as well as the activism of labor is the new influx of immigration. Prior to World War I, there had been a widespread influx of new immigrants into the United States. This leads to competition for jobs and a rise of nativism, the idea that America ought to be just for natives. And they did not mean American Indians. They meant people born in America, and that immigration ought to be limited or severely curtailed. The earlier immigrants were primarily from Northern Europe and Protestant, while these newer immigrants are from the eastern part of Europe and the more Mediterranean, and are therefore largely Catholics and Jews. This cultural difference provokes additional outcry about the influx of new people into America. Importantly, labor unions also push for more restrictions against new immigrants. The people who are in unions, workers, do not want new people to come in and compete with them for their jobs. In 1921, new laws establish a quota on how many people can come into the United States from different countries around the world, both in Europe as well as in South America and Asia. This is a part of a larger school of thought that is called Americanism, or if you prefer, nativism. It's the idea that America ought to be mainly and entirely on the behalf of white Americans, largely Protestants. This produces a revival in the KKK during this time period. It had existed after the American Civil War, but then had largely died out. However, after World War I, due to ideas of immigration and fear and competition, it begins a large revival. It starts as a terrorist group targeting African Americans primarily in the South. Now, in addition to blacks, it is also going to target communists, Catholics, Jews. The idea here is a native white Protestant country that ought to rule everything on behalf and for the benefit of native white Protestant Americans. It moved from its origins in the South into all regions of the country, into the Midwest. A hotbed of Klan activity was actually the state of Indiana. It spreads north to south, east to west, coast to coast. Wherever it emerges, it targets people who are not native white Protestants. It could be Catholics, it could be Jews, it could be Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and of course, especially African Americans. This leads to an outspreading, growth, a migration from the South to the West, to the Midwest, and to the Northeast. African Americans flee terrorism and violence and seek jobs and opportunities, usually traveling by car, as shown here in the upper left, if they could afford it, or by train if they could not. Jobs and opportunities, as well as an important growth in culture. The Cotton Club, the Harlem Renaissance, poetry, jazz, blues, music, all types of culture is spread by African Americans from the South to California, the Midwest, as well as, importantly, Harlem in New York City. By opportunity, we mean jobs. Jobs in places like Detroit, Michigan, a hotbed of industry and manufacturing. By the 1920s, most Americans had a radio, a growth in manufacturing as well as the spread of music and popular culture. Radio is presenting a challenge to the older form of media, newspapers. So to compete, newspapers add things like comic strips, sports sections, want ads, the crossword puzzle to entice people back into buying newspapers. Importantly, a lot of jobs and things are advertised on both radio and newspaper, things like cars. The Model T is produced and developed in Detroit, Michigan, and the towns around Detroit by the Ford Motor Company. It is made through mass production and it is able to be made in large numbers and at a relatively low cost. It is cheap, rugged, reasonable, and reliable. Spread through newspapers as well as through the radio are new popular culture forms like sports, male sports, that they can watch, participate, and enjoy, like the growth and spread of American football. The first heavyweight boxing champion, Jack Johnson, is helping to grow the spread and the popularity of boxing. Incidentally, when he won the championship, he caused riots amongst white people who were so outraged at the thought that a black man could actually compete and win. He also did not appreciate the fact that he had a series of girlfriends who were white. The growth of golf through one of its most well-known champions, Bobby Jones, and of course, most famously, the growth and spread of the popularity of baseball through Babe Ruth, here at the bottom as a member of the New York Yankees, earning $80,000 a year, more at the time than they paid the president. Of course, nowadays, that is commonplace, but here's the growth and emergence of sports media and a mass popular culture. But it is not just sports by and for men. Women also are competing in things like golf. Here is a picture of Gertrude Ederle, who became the first woman to swim the English Channel. Now there are competitions in basketball as well as competitions in the International Olympics. School sports are formed. Water skiing is invented. Both sports to watch and sports to participate in the increasing amount of leisure time that people have in the 1920s as well. Leisure time to go to things like the movies, things like the Nickelodeon, actually called that because each picture cost a nickel to watch. This is the emergence of the sort of mass culture that we think of today, of Hollywood, of celebrities, of famous marriages, and who's dating whom, and who is sleeping with whom. Originally, all movies were silent films. Most importantly, the best known of the actors in that period is Charlie Chaplin, who has a hat, a cane, and a black suit, and he's known as the tramp, who sort of is this put upon guy who's trying to get by in the world, but is sort of stumbling and bumbling his way through. These were comedies. We also see the emergence of heartthrobs. Rudolph Valentino was the great admired male beauty of his day. But by the end of the 1920s, movies as we know them are going to shift through sound, through not just pictures, but sound as well, through musicals, through performance. Here's a poster of the first widespread popular movie with sound, Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. Interestingly, about a Jewish immigrant who doesn't want to follow the ideas of his parents, but to become a popular musician, to do jazz, and importantly, to do jazz in blackface, which was sort of the popular thing of the day, though now, of course, is incredibly recognized as problematic and racist. In addition to changes in popular culture, here are the flappers, a new breed of westernized, quote, modern woman. They wore short skirts. They bobbed their hair. They had jazz music. They danced in public. They wore one-piece bathing suits, and they showed their legs, which was rather controversial at the time. I mean, look, her ankles and knees are on full view. They wore makeup. They drank in public. They smoked, they drove cars, and they importantly challenged social and sexual norms in society. Independent, progressive, proactive women in the world. This is part of the broader movement for women's rights. The 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote is finally adopted and ratified in the year 1920. They began to serve in various state and local offices. They tended to side with the men in their lives, so it is not totally free and independent, as you would imagine, but they do continue to join the workforce, often at the lower end of the scale, as nurses, teachers, and maids. More of them are going to college, especially if they have the means to attend, and they do seek a greater sense of equality in personal bonds and personal relationships as well as marriages. This is all part of the broader movement and thrust towards urbanization. It is a growing rift between the urban areas and the rural countryside. Importantly, after World War I, there was a widespread economic depression, but in farming and agriculture, meaning that the cost of food drops dramatically. People can't afford to work on farms, and therefore they move to city looking for jobs, like the great migration that we have already talked about. More people are going to school. Importantly, now by law, they have to go to school. It's to teach them literacy and language and to achieve new jobs and better, higher quality jobs. It also increases as people could afford to lose the job and labor of children due to new inventions in technology and new tools. In the rural countryside, in addition to some towns and cities, is the growth of what is commonly called fundamentalism. That is just the belief that the Bible is the literal word of God and ought to be interpreted and understood as such. This is actually a relatively new belief at the time. The idea that the Bible must be taken literally. One important person in this movement is Billy Sunday, a baseball player and a minister who rose to national attention as a revivalist, traveling around the country, preaching in fields and in large tents, he's complaining about the changing culture and women whose knees and legs are on view. And this is also tied to the challenging of the teaching of evolution and the ideas of Charles Darwin that should not be allowed to be taught in schools because they challenge the literal interpretation of the Bible. Underpinning this drive for Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, is the broader movement known as Prohibition. It starts much earlier, it peaks during the war, and it culminates in the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1917 that bans the making, the transportation, and the sale of alcohol. It interestingly does not ban the consumption, but if you are making it, transporting it, or selling it, you can be arrested. Now, there were good reasons for this. Widespread alcoholism was a problem. It led to spousal abuse, child abuse, unemployment, and lots of other things. So the thought was if they could outlaw alcohol, this would stabilize the culture and the towns and the cities, especially a bunch of these new immigrants from Europe who, in their mind, tended to get drunk a lot. Prohibition was led and directed by the upper and middle class people, especially Christians as well as women. So throughout the 1920s, in the Jazz Age, in the Harlem Renaissance, and so on, the making, transportation, and sale of alcohol is prohibited or outlawed. Spoiler, this doesn't stop people from actually drinking. This is all part of a broader movement to trade and commerce, specifically the idea of consumption through advertising, through people like Babe Ruth and Coca-Cola, through people like a nice, trusted doctor saying it's actually not bad to smoke, and of course, chewing gum. These new techniques are to persuade, to seduce the audience into buying more and more things, right? Leading to more jobs, more industry, more money, more buying. It's a culture of consumption. And it begins through mass advertisement on the radio, in newspapers, posters, and movies during the 1920s. All this leads to tremendous economic growth, especially located and documented on Wall Street in New York City. The business and marketing lead to an overall increase in consumption, meaning more profits and more businesses can grow and expand and earn more money and have a higher stock price on Wall Street. There's also a new interest in buying and investing in Wall Street. More and more ordinary people can take their money and buy stocks. As stocks keep going up and up and up, they see this and they want to be part of it and they want to get rich. Part of this is the idea that they could buy on margin. What that means is you could put 10% down and buy an amount of stocks. So if I had $100, I could buy $1,000 worth of stock because 100 is 10% of 1,000. So as long as the prices kept going up and up and up, as they did throughout the 1920s, this is not a problem. I can buy on the margin, the price goes up, and I can sell it and I can turn a profit. However, if stocks go down, then I have to pay the full amount, not just the 10% down payment. So what could possibly go wrong? More and more people are having jobs and are buying money and are investing, and the stock market is just going to keep going up and up and up forever. What could possibly go wrong?